Vincent Scully Prize was created in 1999 to recognize and encourage those who have committed their lives to interpreting, improving, and helping us to understand the built environment. In doing so, they help us understand the world in which we live and help us to improve the built environment we leave behind as our legacy. The prize is named after Professor Vincent J. Scully, who is with us this evening, a brilliant teacher, author, and scholar. He has spearheaded the debate about the future of cities and the towns in the United States for over 50 years now. He has guided and inspired generations of architects, planners, as well as thousands of students who have taken his courses at Yale University and the University of Miami. His students have found their lives and viewpoints forever changed by their experiences with him. No other single person in the field has had a greater impact on the way Americans feel about the places we build. He is also the first recipient of this award.
Created as a private institution by an act of Congress in 1980, the National Building Museum welcomes more than 350,000 visitors a year to its extensive exhibition and education programs. It regularly features lectures by leading architects from around the world, and it has become a vital forum for exchanging ideas and information about such issues as the revitalization of urban centers, the quality design of affordable housing, and environmentally sensitive design and construction. Through such awards as the Vincent Scully Prize, the museum also recognizes individuals who contribute to the understanding and improvement of the built environment.
There is one thing which distinguishes him, which is not in the buildings and not in the organization. It is the extraordinary sense of humanity that he has, the great depth of real feeling for real people wherever they find themselves in society. He is the leader of his faith. He's a man who represents the very best in Islam, something that all too often we tend to forget these days, that Islam carries with it values and a culture from which we can all learn. And so it is especially wonderful tonight that he's being honored with this prize for the built environment at a time that we're also thinking of the work that he's done at the human level and indeed the level of faith and morality. And so tonight we have the pleasure of hearing some music from two remarkable players, two great artists who have joined us. Humayun Saki, who is considered by many the finest rubab, that's lute player, of his generation. He studied with Ustad Omar, and he performs in a style of music which reflects the classical raga tradition of North India, and where he infuses instrumentation and rhythms and ornamentation from his Kabuli heritage. And he will be accompanied by Muhammad Essa, who's performing on the tabla.
present the Vincent Scully Prize to His Highness for his contributions to improving the built environment. At the same time, we pay tribute to the immense positive impact the Aga Khan and his Aga Khan Development Network and the Trust for Culture are making to the world in general by providing a beautiful and inspiring window into the Muslim world. His Highness shared with me tonight a piece of news that I find especially inspiring. In addition to the physical aspect of the prize, which is sitting here beside me, there is also a cash prize of $25,000. And the Aga Khan is matching this amount for a total of $50,000, which he is contributing to architectural students from the Third World who study at Harvard, MIT, and Yale to help underwrite the cost of their studies. And as many of you know, there's an Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture at both Harvard and MIT. And he's including Yale in his generous gesture as a tribute to Vincent Scully. Your Highness, please join me on stage.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Your Highness,
Thank you very much.
on behalf of the Vincent Scully Prize jury and the National Building Museum, I present you the 2005 Vincent Scully Prize.
Thank you
Here,
very
I'll give it
much
to you.
indeed. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. I'm very, very honored. Thank you.
And I will take it back and leave the stage. I leave you now. Your work is there.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your presence here this evening. And thank you to the National Building Museum for honoring me with this recognition. I am humbled to receive an award carrying the distinguished name of Vincent Scully. His work as a teacher and critic has reminded the world of the importance of a humane architecture that both respects the past and embraces the future. I might add that my only regret as a Harvard man was that Mr. Scully chose to do so much work at Yale. Ladies and gentlemen, some 30 years ago, I began to question why architecture in the modern Islamic world seemed to have lost touch with the great achievements of its past. I began working with leading architects, philosophers, artists, teachers, historians, and thinkers from all religious faiths to establish an award for architecture. We sought to reshape and reposition knowledge and taste in the public psyche, and to change the behavior of the vast range of actors who shape the built environment. Now, some 20 years later, the extent to which we have been successful is due to a multitude of individuals and organizations from all regions, faiths, and occupations. They have been cemented together by their mutual commitment of service to people through the contribution of time, talent, and knowledge. It is on behalf of this broad spectrum of qualified men and women that I accept the Vincent Scully Award this evening.
It is my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to the museum and to this very special program this evening. I'm also greatly honored to welcome the distinguished individuals who are on tonight's program. I will now invite them up to the stage by their name to take their seats. Each of them will receive a more complete introduction later in the program. Allow me to invite Robert Ivy, Editor-in-Chief of Architectural Record. Charles Correa, an internationally acclaimed architect from Bombay, India. Martin Filler, an architecture critic based in New York City. And our honored guest, His Highness the Aga Khan. Tonight, we will celebrate and explore the many contributions of His Highness the Aga Khan to promote design excellence, urban revitalization, and historic preservation in countries where Muslims have a significant presence.
Architecture itself is a mediating art. It mediates between humankind and nature's implacable laws, and it shapes the communities in which we live together. The awards, so generously conceived and supported by the Aga Khan, do much the same thing. They encourage architecture and city building at their best to mediate between the cultures of East and West, bringing the most beautiful buildings and the most humane urbanism of contemporary Islam forcibly to Western consciousness and admiration. They, and everything they stand for, shine as bright lights in a darkening world. They embody the hope of well-intentioned people everywhere, for civilization itself, for mutual understanding, decent brotherhood, and peace. For this, the Aga Khan deserves our profoundest gratitude, and we take this occasion to thank him and to assure him that we share his faith in architecture's grand and healing role.
Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin my comments this evening by thanking the National Building Museum for the occasion of this seminar. I would also like to thank Professor Scully particularly warmly for having used this occasion to pay compliments to the work that I have done in the past years. I have taken an example from your book. People have often asked me why I created this award for architecture. And I think the video has shown you some of the examples of the issues that have faced people in the developing world, and particularly in the Islamic world, as their physical environment changes. I was concerned that much of the building that was taking place in the Islamic world had lost its sense of direction. There was a hiatus in cultural continuity. There was a lack of clarity and precision in the educational institutions that were forming the young architects of the future. I profoundly believed that architecture is not just about building, it is a means of improving people's quality of life. At its best, it should mirror the plurality of cultural traditions and the diverse needs of communities, both urban and rural. At the same time, it must employ modern technologies to help fulfill desirable aspirations for the future. In Islam, the Holy Quran says that man is God's noblest creation, to whom he has entrusted the stewardship of all that is on earth. Each generation must leave for its successors a wholesome and sustainable social and physical environment. For these reasons, I began in 1977 working with leading architects, philosophers, artists, teachers, historians, and thinkers from all religious faiths to examine issues in the built environment and to establish an award for architecture. The task was extremely difficult and some thought impossible. We sought to reshape and reposition knowledge and taste, and to change the behavior of those who have an impact on the built environment. That meant not just architects and their clients, but governments, planners, granting organizations, village organizations, educational institutions, and builders, large and small, in urban and in rural areas. If we could achieve this, there was a real chance we could launch a process that would become self-sustaining to help bring about the truly profound change that we sought. That led us on a long journey of inquiry and action, based upon a premise which, strangely enough, was never put formally in writing. We were interested in architectural achievement, not just in design, but how good design could help improve the daily lives of the users and beneficiaries. It was from this service perspective that the award parameters grew. One example was the definition of architecture. The users were largely in developing countries, so we pushed our definition far beyond the so-called architected buildings and into self-built environments, many of them in rural areas, most of them poor. It was from this notion of service to people that we were led to search for best practices. We sought examples of best practice for vastly different local situations, from the ultra-poor in rural environments to the ultra-rich cities and towns of oil-producing states. The solutions we found ranged from restoration of historic buildings to the new high-tech buildings of modern societies. The criteria for best practice varied to reflect conditions. Poor communities, for example, do not have the resources to replace buildings every few decades. So we looked to best practice that emphasized efficient and creative refurbishing, or to new construction designed for a much longer economic service life than in industrialized countries. As the inquiry process became more widely known in the communities where we were focused, they responded to us with two basic requests. First, teach us how to do things differently. And second, show us examples of best practices in real-world situations. In response, a number of parallel programs were spawned to teach these best practices, such as the Program for Islamic Architecture at Harvard and MIT, and the online ArchNet resource, which supports global dialogue and research. We were challenged with finding ways of making these best practices available to broad segments of the population in order to have a continuous and positive impact. In the developed world, that would mean reaching the middle classes. In the developing world, it meant making these best practices accessible to the poor. We have had some success in this regard through our Historic City Support Program, which we launched to develop best practice models in the real world. That program has been applied in some of the poorest settlements, many of them in rural areas. We have shown how human and material resources can be applied to deteriorated and underused cultural assets. The result has been new economic activity and a better quality of life. So I am pleased that 28 years later, we have had some success in achieving our original goals. We are gratified that so many others are now engaged in the cause. We have created a momentum that has become a self-sustaining and unstoppable force for change in the human habitat of the Muslim world. And I am most pleased the principles we have established are having an impact in much of the developed world as well. But there is still much to be done. Quality housing remains the most essential need for societies everywhere, both in rural and urban environments. Industrial facilities and workplaces are not at a level of excellence that makes them exceptional. Rapidly expanding urban centers throughout the world lack public parks and open urban spaces. Problems of transport, congestion, and pollution have too few solutions emerging. The growth of slums, the consequence of the relentless forces of urbanization, has not stopped or even slowed down. And although many fine examples of rural projects have been represented in past award cycles, still there are not enough. I am also concerned that there is still too little attention being paid to design for communities to protect residents from the effects of earthquakes, many of them in remote rural areas. 2 million people died as a result of earthquakes in the last century, and 100 million were severely affected. There are vast populations that live in seismic-sensitive high mountain areas where we must focus attention. And the massive devastation of the Indian Ocean's tsunami has taught us a terrible lesson that the destructive power of earthquakes can reach far beyond the initial disturbance. It will no doubt lead to new thinking and new approaches towards seaside construction. So we are by no means at the end of our task. To quote Churchill, we may be at the end of the beginning. I hope next quarter century of the award will contain as much innovation and surprise as the first. To the extent that it does, it will be thanks to the many hundreds of capable individuals who have given so generously and continue to give of their time, their knowledge, and their talent. To all of them, I am enormously grateful. Thank you.
However, we share a unique opportunity to engage His Highness in a frank discussion, building on the work that he has done over these years and examining that work and the programs that surround it. While his own religious community is Islamic, residing on 4 continents, what relevance might the programs that he has established have for our own countries, cultures, for our own communities? What meaning can we draw from it? To achieve these goals, the museum has assembled a thoughtful small gathering on stage, and it will engage in a discussion. We're going to attempt to make this the grandest public space in Washington, as intimate as possible, and have a frank and open conversation. What is the interrelationship, if you will, of this large and vast network of programs that you have and government today?
I'm not sure that there's an interrelationship with government as a government. I think the interrelationship is with the entities of civil society. Mm-hmm. And I think it's the entities of civil society which are going to be the carriers of change in the years ahead. In fact, this program is attempting to invest in the carriers of civil society. It's in education, it's in community organizations, it's in financing agencies. It's in fact, it's affecting the pillars of civil society, mm-hmm. I think, which will become the anchors of change.
Charles, what is the relevance of a word like style in say, East Asia or in Asia? What place does that rather ephemeral sounding word have in a place where needs are great? and
No,
populations are changing.
I think to design or to create something elegant is a reward in itself. I mean, just because people are poor, they don't have to lead ugly lives. In fact, the irony is that some of the poorest societies in the world produce the most beautiful handicrafts, as you know. Mexico right next to you, Nepal, India, other places. No, I think I don't think they live with ugly things. I think in spite of their, they do very well.
Martin, from your perspective as a journalist writing about and thinking about these projects, I'd be interested in your perspective on them as a group. What strikes you about the program or the group of projects?
This is an award not going to star international architects, but to projects honoring, in many cases, patrons, the architects, of course, the communities who represent them.
But the communication of the ideas is part of the challenge. It isn't merely that the award is excellent, it's how are those ideas conveyed and how are they perceived.
I think by seeing and promoting the idea of architecture as something integrated into larger social developments, that you can't have architecture without education, you can't have education without healthcare, you can't have healthcare without architecture, it becomes a unified sense of architecture, and therefore the works that emerge from that point of view, I think, are more resonant. Yes, we want beauty, we want things that are attractive and are aesthetically pleasing, but not to have that as the final goal of architecture.
What is the role of architecture and how is it addressing sort of this immense growth that is occurring right under your nose?
The real thing is this business of opening up the structures of our cities. We've been very lazy about that. Here in this country, this sentence of "Go West, young man" is the most politically profound statement of all, because it really says, don't hang around this place, use space as a resource. And we haven't done that enough. That's why you get squatters in these cities, in Rio de Janeiro.
The program engages a number of those things that you've described. For instance, job creation, I would assume, through Historic Cities program. Could you comment on that? How you see this interplay affecting, ultimately, something as discrete as architecture?
The historic cities traditionally have been transit spaces for newly urbanized populations. And therefore, they are very often the very poor coming from the countryside, going through historic spaces that are degraded by the process of changing hands every 2, 3, 4 years. And I think what we found is that if you invest in those cultural spaces, you can actually turn them into economic generators. And when you turn them into economic generators, you stabilize the population that is in them, and you stabilize the value of the cultural asset. Now that does sometimes mean you have to reutilize the cultural asset for different purposes, and that's sometimes sensitive.
Your Highness, what about this word pluralism? This seems to mean a great deal to you and something that you care very much about and that you discuss. Could you talk to us about what that particular word means to you in the context of architecture?
Yes. Well, I think the nature of the Muslim world is pluralist. It's pluralist in terms of its civilization, it's pluralist in terms of its languages, it's pluralist in terms of its physical environment. And it seems to me that the cultures that have developed in the history of the Islamic world are cultures that deserve to be respected and not washed aside by some normatizing process. And therefore, keeping value to historical continuity is an issue which the award, I think, has felt was important. And therefore, this notion of pluralism is really a notion of respect for cultural identities in a pluralist form. And that's the notion of pluralism in this environment.
Your Highness, thank you again for honoring us with your presence and your wisdom. It's been a wonderful evening for all of us.